So I'm going to apologize right now that you can probably hear my dog chewing a bone in the background. She refuses to be anywhere but the patch of sunshine right next to my feet, and she must be chewing her bone right this minute. So I apologize if it's really annoying. I try to keep outside noise out of my video, but I need to get this one done today, and she apparently needs to be there chewing her bone. Anyway, let's talk about Charles Darwin. So we talked about some of the people that came before him, some of the ideas that Charles Darwin took from them. So let's talk about Charles Darwin himself and what he was actually doing. So Charles Darwin was actually in school to be a minister. He decided that wasn't really for him in England, so he took a job on a boat called the HMS Beagle as a naturalist. So the Beagle was the voyage was to do some mapping along some coastlines, to sort of sail out from England around South America, Australia, the tip of Africa, and do some coastline mapping. So that was the point of the voyage, and Charles Darwin tagged along as a naturalist. So he was going to be taking notes and looking at all the flora and the fauna on the coastlines around where they were working. So this was really important because it allowed Charles Darwin to look at a variety of different organisms all over the world. And he did a lot of work along the South American coast because it's an area that's really rich in biodiversity, a lot of plant life, a lot of animal life. So when the cartographers on the boat were doing their mapping, he was off on the shore picking up samples, taking notes, looking at the various characteristics of these organisms. He looked at islands, he looked at mainland, he was able to look at some fossils in certain places where the rocks on the shore had sort of washed away, and there was some fossil evidence there. So he was able to collect information and samples on thousands of organisms and really look at them and examine their characteristics and where they were living and what sort of adaptations they had. So he did a lot of work and is most famous for his work on the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are a chain of volcanic islands off of South America. And they are really kind of cool islands because they have a lot of unusual organisms there, and a lot of organisms that are found nowhere else. So this group of islands was really important to Charles Darwin because he noticed that these unusual organisms were specifically adapted to their environment. So each island gave a unique habitat and a unique set of habitats, really. Unique weather patterns and geography, and that the organisms that were on those islands were suited specifically for life on those islands. So he is quite famous for studying the Galapagos finches, and the reason that the Galapagos finches are so important is that they're a really good example of adaptation, of having traits that are specific for their specific environment. So on each of these islands, they have specific finches that have different beak shapes. And those beak shapes are specific to the food source on that island, the food source that those birds are eating. So we look, we have a cactus eater, we have a seed eater, we have an insect eater, and if you look, you can see that each of their beaks is differently shaped. So the insect eaters have smaller, more pointed beaks because they are digging into holes in trees and things like that to get insects out, so they need a long pointed beak. The seed eater has a larger beak, a more robust beak, because they have to be able to crack seeds. And those birds that are eating smaller, softer seeds are going to have smaller beaks, and those that are eating larger, harder, drier seeds are going to have bigger beaks. And so they're a really good example of how these organisms are adapted to their environment. Another thing that's important about islands, not just the Galapagos Islands, is that they're really good for studying evolution because they are more isolated. The populations on each of those islands are more isolated than those on the mainland. And so this isolation sort of allows these populations to acquire and accumulate traits that are different from the other populations around them. Something else that's important about islands, especially chains of islands, is that you can sort of see more extreme characteristics as you get away from the mainland. So those organisms that are on the island that are islands or island that are closer to the mainland are going to have more input from the populations on the mainland. Some of those populations, some of those individuals might actually be able to come from the mainland and sort of bring in their genetic information. And so the organisms on the islands closer to the mainland tend to be more similar to the mainland organisms than those on the farther out islands, because those on the farther out islands are not interacting with those populations, and they're more isolated, and they're acquiring characteristics that are more specifically related to their environments. So one of the important things about this idea of descent with modification is that organisms change over time. And they change over time because they have adaptations. Adaptations are inherited characteristics. So remember, there has to be a genetic component to any trait that is going to evolve. So they are inherited characteristics of an organism that enhance their survival and reproduction. So this is really important. An adaptation is something that an organism is born with that increases their chance of survival and reproduction relative to those around them. So one thing that I quite often hear is students say, oh, that animal adapted on its own. Well, no, it didn't. It might have learned, and learning is really important as well. It might be a chimpanzee that has learned to use a stick in a certain way, or I don't know, a canine that has learned to do something, whatever. Those are not necessarily genetically inherited characteristics. For adaptation and evolution to occur, those adaptations, those characteristics that are more beneficial, have to be genetic. And so an organism is born with a set of characteristics. And if it has already in its genetics some of those characteristics that are advantageous, it's going to survive at a higher rate than other individuals that don't have them. Adaptation is really important in producing new species. So if a group of organisms acquire an adaptation that is really useful, say a mutation comes up, or some sort of variation occurs during meiosis, and now you have a new combination that makes this really fantastic trait. And that trait it is different enough that other populations aren't going to interbreed, then maybe you can get the development of new species. So evolution not only changes populations to make them more fit for their environment, but it also can eventually lead to new species. That's a topic that we may or may not get to. That's actually chapter 22, and sometimes I get there, sometimes I don't. You pick up Biology 102 with chapter 22 and talking about new species. So if you move on, you will get that eventually. All right, so natural selection works on traits with a genetic basis. Natural selection is the mechanism through which adaptation occurs. And natural selection is really the basis for this idea of descent with modification. So remember, we are talking about evolution, and evolution is a process of change over time. One of the mechanisms that evolution can occur by is natural selection. Natural selection leads to this idea of descent with modification. So if you're getting a little confused on these different terms, I want you to pause and I want you to write down evolution, natural selection, descent with modification, adaptation, and really keep those terms straight, because they're all really similar, but they all have some really fine key points to them that sort of differ. So natural selection is a process in which individuals that have certain inherited advantageous traits survive at higher rates than others. Now, this is a little different from adaptation, which is where an organism with a trait survives at a higher rate. Natural selection is the process by which adaptation occurs. So as I said, there's sort of some fine differences here. But the process of natural selection is that inherited traits accumulate in a population. So if they're advantageous, those traits are going to accumulate and become more frequent within a population. So we've got a couple of different examples here. I'm going back to the adaptation slide. This guy right in the middle is a moth that has adapted, the population of moths has adapted to look like leaves. So that's an adaptation so that it's not going to get eaten. Something that wants to eat the moth might not notice it. That's camouflage or mimicry. Actually, that's not mimicry, it's camouflage. Over here we've got this some sort of lizard, I'm not exactly sure, chameleon or something, that also has acquired characteristics that it allow it to look like the leaves on that branch. Grasshopper here, same color as the leaf that it's on. Here we've got a hummingbird with a really long beak. So this is a beak that allows it to get nectar from long, thin flowers. So all of these traits are something that have acquired in this species or accumulated in this species over time that allows them to perform a specific function in their environment. So this is also related to the idea of fitness. So fitness is the reproductive success of an individual, and it's all relative. So if you are a bull elk and you have a very successful mating season, and let's say that you have, I don't know, 7 offspring, but there's another bull elk from another population, and he only has 4 offspring in with his herd. That bull elk that had 7 has more relative fitness. It's produced relatively more offspring than another individual. And this is important because that bull that has left more offspring is leaving more of his genetics. He's passing on more of those traits that are advantageous in that environment. Fitness is related to the health of the individual. So if you are more healthy, you look healthy, you're probably going to attract a mate better, you're going to produce hardier offspring, then those offspring are going to survive at a higher rate as well. So fitness is another one that's all related to this idea of natural selection. So if you have an inherited characteristic that allows you to survive and allows you to reproduce at a higher rate, you're a more fit individual. All right, so Charles Darwin wasn't the only one that came up with this idea of descent with modification by means of natural selection. There was another man named ALFRED Russel Wallace, who is considered the co-founder of evolution. So he was actually working at the same time as Charles Darwin, but he was in a different region. So Charles Darwin was doing a lot of his work in South America, the Galapagos Islands, and the coastline in that area. Alfred Russel Wallace was working in the Malay Archipelago, which is this region here, the Philippines and Indonesia, sort of between Asia proper and Australia. And he basically was making the same observations as Charles Darwin and came up with an almost identical idea of evolution, or an identical theory. In 1844, Darwin had actually written an essay on descent with modification and the underlying mechanism of natural selection. But he didn't publish it. He didn't really think that the world was ready for his ideas. He knew that they would be sort of revolutionary. He knew that they would cause an uproar in the sort of traditional belief system of people at the time, because he knew he was challenging the idea of creation. And so he never published it. He continued to work. He wanted to get more information. He really wanted to have a solid basis for his theory before he published his information. But he was good friends with Charles Lyell, who was a geologist with the great mutton chops that we saw a few slides ago. And Lyell really wanted him to publish. He knew that Charles Darwin was onto something. And so he actually presented Alfred Russel Wallace's paper along with Darwin's ideas at a, so I guess sort of like a conference. And it sort of made a splash that Darwin wasn't really ready for. But it was really important because both of these men had accumulated a lot of evidence, and they had come to the same hypothesis based on the same types of evidence. So finally in 1859, Charles Darwin published his famous book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So in this book, Darwin proposed his idea of descent with modification by natural selection and provided tons and tons of evidence to support this observation. And he basically explains how descent with modification by natural selection accounts for all of the diversity that we see on Earth. And he used a lot of his evidence that he had acquired through his time on the HMS Beagle. The first edition never actually mentioned evolution. Again, Charles Darwin didn't set out to disprove anything. He simply wanted to explain things. But he ended up causing a big uproar. He actually does mention in the end of his book that he could see how this idea of natural selection could be applied to humans as well, and so that is often a cause of contention. All right, so there are three main ideas that Charles Darwin proposed. And these sort of big observations sort of explain the unity and diversity of all living things on Earth. So the first is that organisms are fit for their environment, and they are adapted so that they can survive as best they can and leave as many offspring as they can, because the goal of life is to make new life. So over time, populations and therefore individuals in a population accumulate advantageous adaptations. So they, a population will acquire adaptations, accumulate adaptations that are specific for those environments. I have a lot of pictures on here that are basically camouflage because those are really good ways to see this idea of adaptation. If your predator can't see you, you're not going to be eaten. But it's not just camouflage. It's really any characteristic that allows you to survive better in a given environment. So these shared characteristics that living organisms have suggest a common ancestor. And this is a way to explain all of the unity on Earth. So you can think of a common ancestor as sort of a close ancestor. So an ancestor to all of these finches on the Galapagos Islands might be this ancestor that you can't see here. I'll fix that on my PowerPoint. But it might be an ancestral finch, or it might be an ancestral bird even farther back that relates a group of several similar type birds. Or it might be a single common ancestor all the way back to the origins of life. Now we know today that this unity comes from the genetic code, that all organisms share the structure of DNA and the mechanisms of DNA, and that is why organisms look similar. We saw that in chapter 10 when we talked about meiosis, and then in 11 when we started talking about inheritance. The reason that organisms look similar is that they come from common ancestry. It's why brothers and sisters look similar, because they come from similar parents. And that's why your aunts and uncles look similar, because they come from similar parents. And that's why even with all of the diversity within a human population, they all look similar, because they all have common ancestors all the way back. And it's the same thing with animals and plants in the natural world. They are similar because of that genetic code, because they share common ancestor, because they pass down traits that are important in their environment. But at the same time, the fact that DNA can change over time, and the fact that organisms or species can adapt to their environments allows for the diversity that we see on Earth. So even though there's a common ancestor, over time, groups of organisms change. They modify to fit their specific environment. So a fantastic example here are these birds. So we saw finches on the other page that were all closely related. They have different beak shapes, but the overall shape is kind of similar, and their body shape is all similar. And then here we have these birds. So we would all look at these and we would say, yep, that's a bird. It's got wings, it's got feathers, it's got a beak. And those are unifying characteristics. But we can see diversity here as well. These are three very different animals, and yet they're all birds. And they are similar because they had a common ancestor at one point, but they all fit and are all suited for very specific environments in which they live. So this is just kind of a summary of descent with modification. I think I've kind of covered this pretty well at this point. So Darwin actually drew this sketch in his notebook that sort of showed what he meant by descent with modification, that closely related species are similar because they share a common ancestor. So here's this, I think he's proposing that back here there's a common ancestor, and we have these branch points. These ones over here are more closely related to one another than they are to the others, and then same thing over here. These guys are all more closely related. He also recognized that some organisms don't survive. That's these guys here with the little dashes, and some of them do. These are the letters. So he was able to suggest that the reason for these organisms looking similar is that they're actually more closely related. Over here we've got a more specific example. We have our elephants that are currently alive on Earth. They all look pretty similar. They do have their differences. I won't go into them, and I don't know all of their differences other than their ear shape, basically. But you can see there are these other animals. These are all extinct at this point, but you can tell that they are quite similar. And if you were asked to categorize them, you would probably put them in a group with these other elephants. But then we have these other guys up here. We have a couple of extinct species here, and then we have some living species, the hyraxes and the manatees. You might be interested to know that manatees are most closely related to elephants. They call them elephants of the sea. They also call them sea cows because they graze, but that's okay. They have a similar common ancestor with the current groups of elephants on Earth. Hyraxes are not a commonly known one. I always forget what they actually are. I have to look them up every year when I do this lecture, but they are a similar organism that actually looks very different from an elephant because they have those hyraxes, and the manatees have adapted to fit their environments. Manatees live in the water, so they are swimming all the time. They don't have the big long trunks that an elephant does because the elephant is in a very different environment. All right, so if we take all of these observations and we put them together, we get the idea of natural selection and evolution. So there are a few observations. Individuals in a population vary in their heritable characteristics. So in any population, you're going to have variation. Remember, we've listed several ways that we get variation in a population at this point. If natural selection is going to occur, there has to be variation. Organisms in a particular species, in a particular environment, have to be slightly different with respect to some of their traits. Along with that, organisms produce more offspring than can survive. This is sort of just one of those facts of life things. Not every organism that is born is going to survive. And then if we put this with Malthus's idea of overpopulation, that kind of supports this. Some offspring fail to survive and reproduce. And what we can get from that is that individuals who have variation and whose variation it makes them better suited to their environment are going to be more fit. They're going to leave more offspring than other individuals who do not have those specific traits. Over time, the population is going to change. The population is going to accumulate those favorable traits. So natural selection really is sort of a process that works on individuals. So an individual is born with a certain trait, and then another individual in the population is born with its own set of traits. And let's say one of them lives and one of them dies. That individual that lives is going to pass on its favorable traits. Let's say we have 3 individuals, and one individual has a set of traits, individual number 2 has a set, and individual number 3 has a set. Let's say number 3 is the one that died. Unfortunate for number 3, but he didn't survive at all. Number 2, let's say he only passes on his genes to 2 offspring. An individual number 1, let's say he passes it on to 10. That individual that has those favorable characteristics that allows it to survive and be more successful in its environment is going to pass on those traits in a higher frequency than the others. And so natural selection works on individuals, but evolution works on a population. Favorable traits accumulate in a population, and the population begins to acquire characteristics that are advantageous. So let's sort of summarize natural selection and evolution. So an individual's inherited traits, the traits that it's born with, influence its own performance. So that individual is going to survive and reproduce better than others if they have a particular set of traits, or maybe even just one specific trait. But then they pass on those genes to the next generation. So they're not only affecting their own survival, but they're also affecting the survival of their offspring. You know, I've been talking about sort of one individual dying and the other one living, but it doesn't take a lot of advantage to change a population. Even just a slight advantage is going to increase their relative survival. So even if you just leave one more offspring than someone else, you're putting more advantageous traits in that population.